What if I told you that this tiny 2-pence coin is connected to one of the biggest changes in British history? Look closely at the date on this coin, 1971. That number may look ordinary, but it takes us back to the exact year. Britain completely changed the way its money worked. This little bronze coin was part of a brand new currency system that replaced the old pounds, shillings, and pennies. And there is something else you should notice. Around the famous three-feather design, the coin says new pence. Why did Britain need to tell people that these were new pence? How many of these coins were actually made? And is a 1971 2p really rare? Or has the internet created a huge misunderstanding about its value? Today we're going to uncover the complete story of this fascinating 1971 British 2 new pence coin. To understand why this coin matters, we have to travel back to Britain before 1971. At that time, British money worked very differently from the system we know today. There were pounds, shillings, and old pennies. 1 pound was divided into 20 shillings, and each shilling contained 12 old pennies. That meant there were 240 old pennies in 1 pound. For people who had grown up using this system, it was completely normal. They knew how to calculate prices, wages and change using pounds, shillings, and pence. But for a modern economy, the system was complicated, and Britain eventually decided that it was time for a major change. The solution was decimalization. Instead of having 240 old pennies in a pound, the new system would have 100 pence in 1 pound. On 15th of February 1971, Britain officially introduced its decimal currency. That historic day became known as Decimal Day. It was an enormous national change. Banks, shops, businesses, and ordinary people all had to adapt to the new system. New coins were needed in enormous quantities, and among those new coins was the 2-pence piece that we are looking at today. Imagine being alive in Britain on Decimal Day. You wake up in the morning knowing that the money system you have used for years is changing. Suddenly, new coins are appearing in your pocket. People have to learn what each coin is worth. Shopkeepers have to calculate prices differently, and the public has to understand how the new decimal system works. The government and the Royal Mint had spent years preparing for this moment because changing the currency of an entire country was an enormous operation. More than 2 billion decimal coins were struck ahead of Decimal Day, so Britain would have enough new money for the transition, and this is where the 1971 2p becomes fascinating. Look at the words on the coin, new pence. Today, those words might seem unnecessary. Of course it is pence. But in 1971, the word new had an important purpose. Britain had just moved away from its traditional pre-decimal currency, so people needed to understand that these coins belonged to the new decimal system. The words new pence helped distinguish the new decimal coins from the old currency that people had used for generations. In other words, the coin was literally announcing that Britain had entered a new monetary era. Now look at the beautiful design in the center of the coin. You can see 3 feathers rising above the number 2, surrounded by a coronet. This is the badge of the Prince of Wales, and it was chosen as the reverse design for the British 2p coin. The design was created by British coin designer Christopher Ironside, whose work became an important part of Britain's new decimal coinage. Ironside wasn't simply designing something attractive. He was helping create the visual identity of an entirely new British currency. Think about that for a moment. Imagine designing a coin that millions of people are going to carry in their pockets, use in shops, give to children, and exchange every single day. Your artwork could potentially be seen by an entire nation. That's what happened with Ironside's decimal designs. His work became part of everyday British life, and the 2p reverse design remained familiar for generations. The other side of the coin carries the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, who was Britain's reigning monarch when decimalization took place. So this tiny coin brings together 2 important parts of British history. On one side, you have the monarch. On the other, you have the Prince of Wales's feathers and the denomination. And surrounding the design are the words that remind us of the enormous change taking place in 1971, new pence. The physical coin is interesting too. The early 1971 2p was made from bronze, with a composition of approximately 97% copper, 2.5% zinc, and 0.5% tin. It weighed around 7.12 grams and measured approximately 25.9 millimeters across. That bronze composition is responsible for the warm, copper-brown appearance that many collectors associate with these early British decimal coins. Over more than 5 decades, however, the surface of a coin can change dramatically. Exposure to air, moisture handling, and the environment can cause the color to darken and the surface to develop different tones. Now comes the question that almost everyone asks when they see an old coin. How many were made? This is where the story becomes very important because a lot of people assume that every 1971 2p is extremely rare. In reality, more than 1.4 billion 1971 dated 2p coins carrying the new Pence inscription were struck. That's an enormous number. So while your 1971 coin is historically significant because it comes from the first year of Britain's decimal 2p coinage, the date alone does not automatically make it a rare or extremely valuable coin. This is one of the biggest lessons in coin collecting. Old does not always mean rare, and rare does not always mean valuable. A coin can be 50, 60, or even hundreds of years old and still be relatively common. What really matters is the combination of factors such as mintage, condition, rarity, varieties, errors, demand, and authenticity. That's why collectors don't simply look at the year. They examine every detail. Now let's look at the condition of the coin shown in the video. This particular example has clearly been circulated. The surface has developed darker areas, and some of the finer details have softened through wear. That's completely understandable, because this coin was originally designed as everyday currency. It wasn't created to sit safely inside a collector's case. It was made to travel from person to person, through shops, pockets, purses, and cash registers. Just imagine the journey this little coin may have taken. When it was first struck in 1971, it would have been fresh and bright. Someone received it as change. Perhaps they bought something with it. Then another person received it. Maybe it was carried in a pocket for years. Maybe it was dropped on a street. Maybe it sat inside a shopkeeper's cash drawer. Perhaps a child saved it in a small collection. Eventually, it could have ended up forgotten in a box or drawer. More than 50 years later, it is now being examined again. And that is one of the reasons old coins are so fascinating. A coin doesn't have a diary. We don't know exactly where it has been or who has held it. But the scratches, wear, color, and condition give us clues about its life. Every mark is evidence that the coin has survived decades of history. It may not be a rare coin, but it is still a survivor from 1971. There is also one important thing you should never do if you discover an old coin like this. Don't rush to clean it. Many people find an old coin and immediately want to make it shiny. They might use polish, chemicals, or abrasive materials. But this can damage the original surface and leave scratches that collectors don't want to see. If you believe you have found an interesting old coin, the best approach is to identify and research it before attempting to clean it. Now let's talk about the biggest myth surrounding the 1971 2p. You may have seen videos or posts online claiming that a 1971 2p with new Pence is automatically worth a huge amount of money. Some people even claim that these coins can be worth hundreds or thousands. But that is not how coin valuation works. The fact that your coin says 1971 and new Pence is completely normal for a 1971 2p. The Royal Mint Museum has even described the idea that these coins are automatically rare as an urban myth. So why do people get confused? The answer comes from a later coin. In 1982, the inscription on the 2p was changed from new Pence to 2 pence. That makes sense because by then Britain had been using decimal currency for more than a decade. The word new was no longer necessary because decimal money was no longer new. But then something unusual happened in 1983. Some 1983 2p coins were produced with the old new Pence wording. That was not what collectors would normally expect for that year, and those pieces became a famous collector curiosity. And this is why the date on your coin is so important. If you have a 1971 2p with new Pence, that wording is exactly what we would expect. If you had a 1983 2p with new Pence, however, the story would be completely different. So never look at the words alone. Always look at the date and the wording together. But even though a normal 1971 2p may not be a fortune, that doesn't make it boring. In fact, I would argue that its history is more interesting than a simple price tag. This coin was produced during a moment when an entire country was changing its monetary system. Millions of people had to learn new values and new coins. Businesses had to adapt. Banks had to prepare. And this tiny piece of bronze became part of that transformation. Think about what else has changed since 1971. Technology has completely transformed. Cars look different. Televisions have changed. Phones have gone from landlines to smartphones. Shops have changed. Prices have changed. Generations have come and gone. But this little coin has survived through all of it. It is a physical object that connects us directly to a world that existed more than 50 years ago. That's why I like to think of the 1971 2p as a tiny time capsule. You don't need a huge historical monument to understand the past. Sometimes history is sitting inside an old drawer. A coin can tell us about economics, politics, design, manufacturing, royalty, and everyday life. And the 1971 2p manages to tell all of those stories at once. So if you have one of these coins at home, what should you actually look for? Start with the date. If it says 1971, you have a first-year decimal 2p. Then look at the words. New pence is correct for this year. Next, examine the condition. Look at the Queen's portrait, the 3 feathers, the lettering, and the overall surface. Finally, look for anything genuinely unusual. But be careful not to mistake normal damage or wear for a minting error. And most importantly, don't believe every price you see online. Someone asking $500 for a coin doesn't mean someone actually paid $500 for it. A genuine valuation requires looking at the exact coin, its condition, its variety, its authenticity, and actual market demand. If you believe you have something unusual, getting an experienced coin dealer or numismatist to examine it can be much more useful than trusting a random internet claim. Now let's return one last time to the coin in our video. It may look like a simple old 2p, but the date tells us that it was born in 1971, the year Britain entered the decimal age. The words new pence tell us that the country was introducing a completely new monetary system. The 3 feathers connect the coin to the historic badge of the Prince of Wales. The portrait connects it to Queen Elizabeth II, and the bronze surface tells the story of more than 5 decades of survival. So is this 1971 2p worth a fortune? Probably not, simply because it is from 1971. But that's not the point. The real value of this coin is the story it carries. It was part of Britain's transition from pounds, shillings, and old pennies to the decimal currency system we know today. It was part of Decimal Day. It was part of one of the biggest changes in everyday British life during the 20th century. And the next time you see a coin like this, don't just think, it's only 2 pence. Stop for a moment. Look at the date. Look at the lettering. Look at the design. Think about the people who used it more than 50 years ago. Think about the world they lived in. Think about how different money was when this coin was brand new, because sometimes the most fascinating coins aren't the ones worth thousands of pounds. Sometimes they're the coins that allow us to hold history in our hands. And this tiny 1971 British 2 new pence is one of them. So now that we know the history behind this little 1971 coin, there is one final question we need to answer. What is this coin really worth? And the answer may surprise you. If you were hoping that every 1971 2p with the words new pence is a hidden fortune, unfortunately that's not the case. More than 1.4 billion 1971 2p coins were produced, so an ordinary circulated example is not considered extremely rare simply because it carries the date 1971, but that doesn't make the coin unimportant. In fact, the reason this coin is fascinating has much more to do with its history than with a huge price tag. Think about what this coin actually witnessed. In 1971, Britain was leaving behind a monetary system that had existed for generations. People had spent their entire lives using pounds, shillings, and old pennies. Then suddenly a completely new decimal system arrived. New coins appeared in shops and pockets across the country, and people had to learn how to use them. This little 2p was one of those coins at the very beginning of that transformation. When you hold a genuine 1971 2p today, you're holding something that was part of Britain's first year of decimal currency. And that's why the words new pence are so important. Today they might look ordinary, but in 1971 they were announcing something completely new. They were telling the public that this wasn't the old British money they had been using for generations. This was the new decimal currency. The word new wouldn't remain forever. Once people became familiar with decimal money, the inscription was changed to 2 pence. But on this 1971 coin, the words remain a permanent reminder of that historic transition. Now take another look at the three feathers in the center of the coin. They aren't random decorations. They represent the badge of the Prince of Wales, giving the coin a connection to Britain's royal and heraldic history. And then turn the coin over and you find the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. Suddenly, this small piece of bronze connects every day, British money with the monarchy, and the country's transition into a modern monetary system. That's an incredible amount of history packed into a coin that originally had a face value of just 2 pence. There's also something beautiful about the condition of an old circulated coin. Look closely at the surface. The color has changed. Some of the details are softer. There are marks from years of handling. But instead of seeing those imperfections as meaningless damage, think about what they represent. Every scratch could have been created during a transaction. Every worn section could be evidence of thousands of touches. The coin has been used, carried, exchanged, and eventually preserved, long enough for someone to discover it again, more than 50 years later. And this is where the story gets even more interesting. The words "new pence" eventually disappeared from the 2p coin. From 1982, the normal inscription became 2 pence, but some 1983 pieces were produced with the older "new pence" wording. That is a completely different situation from your 1971 coin. In 1971, new pence is exactly what we expect to see. In 1983, seeing those words can make a coin much more interesting to collectors. So if you ever search through a box of old British 2p coins, don't just look for the words. Look at the date first. Now imagine this coin when it was brand new. It is 1971. The bronze is bright. The edges are sharp. The Queen's portrait is crisp. The three feathers are clearly defined. The words "new pence" are easy to read. The coin is placed into circulation, and someone receives it as change. They have no idea that 50 years later somebody will be filming it, examining it and telling its story. To that person it was simply 2 pence. But history doesn't always look important while it's happening. That's what makes old coins so powerful. A famous historical event might be recorded in books, photographs, and documentaries. But a coin gives you something different. You can actually hold it. You can look at the same design that someone looked at in 1971. You can see the same words. You can feel the same piece of metal. The coin becomes a physical connection between your hands and another generation. So if you have a 1971 2p at home, don't immediately ask, "How much money can I make from this?" Ask a different question. What story does this coin tell? It tells the story of decimal day. It tells the story of Britain's transition into decimal currency. It tells us about the design work of Christopher Ironside. It carries the Prince of Wales's feathers. It carries the portrait of Queen Elizabeth, too, and it reminds us that Britain's money once looked completely different from the coins we use today. And maybe that's the greatest secret of this coin. Its biggest value may not be financial. Its biggest value may be historical, because when you hold this 1971 2p, you're not simply holding 2 pence. You're holding a survivor from the moment Britain changed the way it counted money. More than 50 years have passed since this coin entered circulation. Generations have grown up since then. The technology of everyday life has changed beyond recognition. Yet this tiny bronze coin is still here, still carrying the same date, still carrying the same design, still carrying those 2 fascinating words, "new pence." So the next time you find an old 1971 2p coin, don't throw it into a drawer and forget about it. Pick it up, turn it over, look at the date, examine the design, look at the condition, and remember that this little coin was once part of one of the biggest changes in Britain's everyday life. Because sometimes, the most fascinating treasure isn't the coin that makes you rich.